sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. If you get there before I do, coming for to carry me home, tell all my friends I'm a-coming to, coming for to carry me home.
On August 28th, 1963, nearly 250,000 people assembled near the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. to participate in one of the largest political rallies in American history, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered an iconic speech.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Shortly after Dr. King concluded his inspiring 17-minute-long speech that day, actor Ossie Davis introduced the day's next speaker.
The executive director of the March on Washington, the man who organized this whole thing, Mr. Bayard Rustin.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first demand is that we have effective civil rights legislation, no compromise, no filibuster, and that it includes public accommodation, decent housing, integrated education, FAPC, and the right to vote. What do you say?
That's Bayard Rustin, the chief organizer of this historic event. He was born and raised in Westchester, Pennsylvania. He became an influential civil rights activist who devoted his life to advancing the cause of social justice. Despite his influential role in the civil rights movement, Rustin largely remained behind the scenes. As an openly gay man, Rustin stayed out of the spotlight, not wanting to detract from the movement's mission. But in recent decades, Rustin has slowly earned national recognition. Shortly after his death in 1987, President Ronald Reagan applauded Rustin's leadership in the struggle for civil rights in the United States and for human rights throughout the world. And in 2014, President Barack Obama posthumously awarded Bayard Rustin the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
Bayard had an unshakable optimism, nerves of steel, and most importantly, a faith that if the cause is just and people are organized, nothing can stand in our way. So for decades, this great leader, often at Dr. King's side, was denied his rightful place in history because he was openly gay. No medal can change that, but today we honor Bayard Rustin's memory by taking our place in his march towards true equality, no matter who we are or who we love.
In recent years, Rustin has received growing recognition as a national American hero. But his story did not begin on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Instead, his story has local roots, grounded right here in Chester County. On June 15th, 1892, Rustin's maternal grandparents, Jennifer A. Rustin and Julia E. Davis, married at Westchester's Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. Born enslaved in Port Tobacco, Maryland in 1864, Jennifer was not free until the age of 1, when the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified. Likely seeking better opportunities, Jennifer headed north, across the Mason-Dixon line into Chester County by the 1880s. Here, he met and married Julia E. Davis, whose family had established connections to the local Quaker community. In fact, Rustin credited his grandmother's Quaker upbringings with influencing his career.
I was largely influenced by my grandmother, who was a graduate of the Quaker schools in Westchester, and whose mother had been reared in the Quaker household of the Butler family. And my grandmother was a contemporary with Smedley D. Butler, who was a general in the United States Army, though a Quaker. And it was, I think, my earliest influences were those of the Quakers, the belief in non-injury, non-violence, respect for other people, and the like.
Jennifer and Julia had 8 children together. Their oldest daughter, 19-year-old Florence, gave birth to a baby boy on March 17th, 1912. The family named the child Bayard, after the local Quaker poet and diplomat Bayard Taylor. Unfortunately for the young Rustin, he never developed a close relationship with his mother or his father, Archie Hopkins, who lived on the 300th block of East Gay Street.
They were both very immature youngsters. They had no way of taking care of me. Consequently, my grandparents, that is my mother's mother and father, took me in. And actually, I must have been maybe 11 years of age, or 12, before I knew that my mother was my mother, because being born into a family in which she was the oldest, and in which my aunts and one uncle pretty much treated me as a member, as a brother or sister. Until this day, I consider those relatives who are still living my brothers and sisters rather than my aunts and uncles.
The family frequently moved during Rustin's childhood. He spent his early years in a small row home on East Minor Street, in a historically black neighborhood called Georgetown. But by 1916, the family had the opportunity to move to a large house across town on North New Street. Jennifer worked as a steward at the local Elks Lodge, a prominent social club for the town's affluent white residents. There, Jennifer befriended a member of the Ricci family, who rented the house at 113 North New Street to the Rustins. Moving across town to a predominantly Italian neighborhood came with extraordinary benefits, like being exposed to real Sicilian pizza. But Rustin was also subjected to the racist undertones permeating his small hometown.
I lived in a part of town which was near the Catholic Church and near the Italian part of town. And many things, even matters like pizza, which were totally unknown at that time outside the Italian community. And I learned to eat that because my best friend was a kid whose name was Pascal de Bundo. And Pascal de Bundo lived across the street from us. And for some perfectly an illogical reason, because he never used unkind language, but I made him angry. And I cannot even remember why I made him angry, but I'm sure I must have, because he wouldn't have responded if I hadn't. And he said, you're acting like a nigger. Well, this struck me as very hard because I was very fond of him.
From his house on North New Street, Rustin learned an important lesson about helping those less fortunate. This was during a period historians have called the Great Migration, a mass exodus of black Southerners away from the Deep South and towards urban industrial hubs like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia. According to Rustin, his family welcomed many Southern newcomers into their home as they made their journey north.
So that very often the top floor at this big old house, which had 3 rooms and which children slept, very often we would be hustled out of our beds late at night to make room for a family which didn't have anywhere to go and was passing through town.
One night, Rustin suddenly awoke to the smell of gas, and the traumatic experience would have a lasting impact on his career.
So I ran down to the floor beneath and knocked on my grandfather's door, And he said to me, "My God, there's gas." And he said, "Get everybody out of here." Because these poor people from the South who had been used before they went to bed to just take the shade off an oil lamp and blow it out, had seen gas for the first time. And they simply took the shade off and blew the gas out and went to bed. And it was, for me, a very traumatic experience. And I think one of my earliest interests in trying to recognize the need to help people and to be concerned about people sprang from that unfortunate experience.
Now, when it came to schooling, Rustin originally attended the segregated Gay Street School on the east end of town. The Gay Street School opened in 1894 and served as the primary grade school for the town's black students. There were not enough students to justify a separate black high school, however, so after Rustin graduated from 8th grade, he enrolled in the integrated Westchester High School in the center of town. He made the most of his 4 years at Westchester High School, having played on the football and track teams, as well as participating in a multitude of other extracurricular activities like chorus, drama club, French club, and history club. Rustin polished his writing and oratory skills, authoring essays, poems, and speeches for various contests and school publications. He relied on these skills later in his career to deliver passionate speeches that rallied the masses. When asked about his experience as a black student in a predominantly white school, Rustin remembered his days at Westchester High fondly. He credited his involvement in so many activities for helping him form friendships with both black and white students around mutual interests. In fact, it was outside school when Rustin primarily faced racial discrimination.
It was when I got to the integrated high school that what segregation was began to bear down upon me, because although going to school with the white boys and girls every day and being very well liked by them, and I must say very popular with them, when we left the school for any activity, that is when the segregation and discrimination appeared.
Rustin specifically remembered the segregated movie theater in town, likely referring to the Warner, which opened its doors in 1930.
Now, I never thought about the school as being segregated, but very early I thought about the theaters as being segregated, because I always had white friends even at that period, because there were whites living in my neighborhood, and my two best friends were Italian. But when I went to the movies, I always had to sit over on a side where there were just 2 rows of seats running the whole length of the theater, and they could sit where they wanted. And that's when I began to notice there was something wrong.
But it wasn't just the theaters. Rustin also faced open discrimination when he and his friends went into town for lunch or visited the YMCA on High Street.
Or when we went into the 5 and 10 at lunchtime, occasionally to pick up something, and I would see white kids sitting at the counter, but if I went to the counter for something, they wanted me to pack it up and take it out. Or the YMCA. Since I was involved in all kinds of sports, there would often be the teams of the high school, for an example, would go over to the YMCA for extra practice in the winter time. Well, I wasn't allowed to go.
Despite his diverse group of friends, Westchester pushed Rustin to see the reality of the world and all its prejudices. And his experiences with hate were not all directed towards him. In 1928, a Jewish friend approached Rustin about handing out political leaflets and buttons for Democrat Al Smith's presidential campaign.
He said, let's start over by the country club and work back toward town. The country club is on the outskirts, as they always are, in a beautiful grassy park. And we invaded that country, which was highly Episcopalian and Baptist. And naturally, we were terribly abused. But what made me so aware of anti-Semitism was that wherein they simply looked on me as being under his tutelage, which in part I was. Nobody spit at me or spit on me or called me a bastard, but they did him. That was when I discovered that that very often Jews were treated even worse than blacks.
That memory left an indelible impression on Rustin, who later advocated for Jews domestically and abroad, especially in the Soviet Union, where, according to Rustin, Jews faced persecution similar to African Americans in the United States. These personal experiences, coupled with his grandparents' philosophy and teachings, laid a foundation for Rustin to launch into the work he cared so deeply about. After graduating from Westchester High School in 1932, Rustin briefly attended Wilberforce University in Ohio and Cheyney State Teachers College before permanently moving to New York City in 1937. By that time, Rustin officially embraced the Quaker faith that was originally instilled at an early age by both his grandmother and his hometown. Bayard Rustin went on to play an integral role in some of the most significant political movements in American history. Yet his driving motivations emerged from the streets of downtown Westchester. Although Rustin moved on to the bright lights of New York City and Washington, D.C., his family remained in the Westchester area. In January 1950, Rustin began to contact realtors to, quote, find a small house in Westchester, Pennsylvania, that I can begin to buy since my grandmother, who is quite old, needs a home in which to live. Like today, the real estate market was competitive, and Rustin was selective enough to pass on an available home because, quote, my grandmother is 78 years old, and wherever she is, she ought to have a bathroom and central heating, if at all possible. On June 21st, 1950, Rustin wrote a letter to Joseph R. Fugit, who was the principal of the Gay Street School that Rustin attended as a child. Rustin thanked Fugit for his assistance in securing a home on West Lafayette Street for his grandmother, Julia. Rustin's appreciation and concern for his grandmother is apparent as he continued to share, quote, I sincerely trust that this will put an end to the anxiety which Mama has had in recent years. She was so good to all of us that she should not have to face this sort of thing in old age. From the Bethel AME Church to his childhood homes on Minor and New Streets, Westchester, Pennsylvania shaped Bayard Rustin into the 20th century crusader that he was. Although his work in the civil rights movement has attracted praise in recent decades, Rustin's legacy remains controversial, even in his hometown. In 2002, the Westchester Area School District broke ground for a new public high school located right outside the borough. The school board solicited potential names from the local community, and the name Bayard Rustin High School came under serious consideration. Not everyone embraced the idea, however, as some pointed to Rustin's refusal to serve in World War II, a decision based on his pacifist Quaker beliefs, as unpatriotic and undeserving of such an honor. One school board member argued his sexual orientation was a character flaw, while others took exception to his ties to communism. While the school board ultimately voted in favor of the name Bayard Rustin High School, the debate proved that topics like civil rights, gay rights, patriotism, and tolerance largely remain some of the most contentious issues in American civic discourse. Yet throughout his life, Rustin had the moral courage to stand up for his convictions and confront these divisive ideas head-on, because he knew in doing so he was advancing America's slow but steady march towards true social justice and equality for all. Rustin often said, freedom is never a final act, and his legacy inspires us to participate in that ongoing struggle.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. I look over Jordan, what do I see? Coming for to carry me home. A band of angels coming after me, coming for to carry me home.